Hi everyone, and welcome back to the All on the Line North Carolina Redistricting Leadership Program. It's great to see you all again. All right, so here's the course outline, and as you can see, today we are doing the North Carolina Redistricting Process Basics lesson. So, North Carolina Redistricting Basics. The way we will walk through this is we will go through what is in the North Carolina State Constitution. We will then talk about the process itself a little bit. We will do a section where we'll go through our key takeaways from the lesson, and then we actually have a little action assignment at the end. All right, what's in the North Carolina State Constitution? So, the Constitution of North Carolina, Article 1, Section 10 says all elections shall be free. So this doesn't obviously relate to redistricting, but I wanted to put it in here because it's actually something that's going to become really important, especially when we start talking about the lawsuits against partisan gerrymandering that have happened in our state courts. This clause becomes super important in that, and I just kind of want to remind you all that it is in there. It's a good provision. It's something we're going to come to rely on. But the parts of the Constitution that explicitly talk about redistricting is Article 2, Sections 3 and 4. So right here, I have Section 4 up, and Section 3 is actually exactly the same. Section 4 talks about how we redistrict for state representatives, and Section 3 talks about how we do it for state senators, but otherwise the text is exactly the same. So I've just thrown out one example here. And I'm not going to read it all through for you right now. I think that would be a little overwhelming. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through this section by section. All right, so breaking it down. The senators and representatives shall be elected from districts. And you watched the last lesson, so you know what districts are, so I don't need to explain that to you. And then it starts the General Assembly. So the General Assembly is being cited here because the General Assembly has the power to draw the districts. The General Assembly is the body that's being called upon in the Constitution to do this redistricting. No other officials are involved, so in a lot of other states, the governor might have a veto over redistricting bills, but in North Carolina, the legislature has sole power in redistricting. So it says the General Assembly at the first regular session. So the North Carolina legislature comes together each year to work on legislation. And those times when they come together officially to work on legislation are called sessions. And just as a little bit more information, odd-numbered years like 2021, like next year, have a long session. So that means that the session is just, it's a long session. It's longer. They spend more time in Raleigh. They tend to work have time to work on more legislative issues than in the short session, which is an even year. So this year, 2020, we have a short session. Like I said, the short session is shorter, and they tend to mostly focus on the budget and not do quite as much other legislative work. And the reason we have this long and short session alternating is that our legislature is theoretically a part-time legislature. And I know that may come as a surprise to some of you who realize how much time they seem to spend in Raleigh doing all kinds of things, which I won't comment upon the quality of. But they are technically a part-time legislature, and they have long and short sessions alternating. All right, so the General Assembly at the first regular session convening after the return of every decennial census of population taken by order of Congress. So the General Assembly is going to do the redistricting in their first session that happens after the census data is returned. So that means in 2021 or years that end in 1, the year after the census is taken. And I think an important thing to point out about this is that this implies that what we're doing is using census data to draw those districts because we're doing it in the year after the census comes back. But that's not explicitly stated in here, and I think that's something important to pay attention to because that's a little bit dangerous, and it's something that unscrupulous people could try to take advantage of. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So continuing breaking it down. The General Assembly, in that session after the census, shall revise the Senate and representative districts and the apportionment of senators and representatives among those districts. So that's what they're doing. They're redrawing the districts, and they are reconfiguring how senators and representatives are distributed among those districts. So now in modern redistricting in North Carolina, we would redraw the districts, and each district will just get, one senator or one representative. But this is basically referring back to what we saw in the last lesson, where we had that weird situation basically until the 60s, where some districts had 4 representatives, some districts had 2 senators, all kinds of stuff. So that's why that seems a little bit confusing, but now that would just mean that we are redrawing the districts based on population. All right. Each senator and representative shall represent, as nearly as may be, an equal number of inhabitants. The number of inhabitants that each representative represents being determined for this purpose by dividing the population of the district that he represents by the number of representatives apportioned to that district. And I mean, you can see the gender stuff in there. I don't want to point that out because it will just make me mad. But this refers to inhabitants. Inhabitants is the number that we're using to draw the districts, right? So inhabitants means that we're counting everyone who lives in that district, and that is the population number we're using to determine what the size of that district should be. And that's really important because I'm sure a lot of you have heard about how there were some efforts by the current administration to add a citizenship question to our census, presumably to take advantage of that for redistricting purposes, so that they would only use citizen population numbers when doing redistricting, which obviously is really, really distorting of representing who actually lives in those places. All right, so, and I will also note here that most of the redistricting reform bills that we've seen in North Carolina to be filed in the legislature in the past year or so also contain language that would change this inhabitants language and open us up to the use of data other than just pure population, which, is a little scary. All right, so we're going to keep going through this. Keep going through this section of the Constitution. Each representative district shall at all times consist of contiguous territory. All right, contiguous territory just means that you can't have a section of a district over here and a section of a district over here with nothing to connect them. The district has to be, all parts of it have to be connected to each other somehow. I think we've probably all seen the gerrymandered maps where there's a little tiny skinny line connecting two larger pieces, and that happens because they have to be contiguous. All right. So next, no county shall be divided in the formation of a representative district. So this clearly conflicts with one person, one vote. Not all counties have the same population. It's, a weird thing that's in our Constitution, and there are ways that the courts have sort of gotten around this in North Carolina, and we'll talk about them in more detail later. But just note, that's something that's in our Constitution that conflicts with the Supreme Court's interpretation of federal law. So, there. When established, the representative districts and the apportionment of representatives shall remain unaltered until the return of another decennial census of population taken by order of Congress. So this is often called the prohibition on mid-decade redistricting. What it means is that the legislature comes together in the year after the census is returned to draw districts, and they are not allowed to reconvene to redistrict again until the next census is returned. So they can't just, in the middle of the decade get together and say, hey, we feel like redistricting again now. It's not allowed by our Constitution. Now again, like I always say, redistricting can happen mid-decade if it's ordered by a court, which I always have to say because this is North Carolina, and North Carolina is constantly being ordered by courts to redistrict because we are so terribly gerrymandered. All right, So what did we actually learn from this section of the state constitution about redistricting? So we learned that the legislature has the sole authority to draw the maps. Redistricting happens in North Carolina in the year after the census is taken, so years ending in 1, like 2021. Census data is traditionally used, but not actually mandated by the state constitution, which is obviously bad. The districts must be contiguous. Districts can't be redrawn again until after the next census. And then there's like some sort of archaic stuff. Legislators have to represent an equal number of inhabitants, but the Constitution doesn't say that districts have to be an equal number. Now, obviously, because of one person, one vote, we know that the districts have to be the same size according to federal law, but our state constitution doesn't quite say that. Counties must be kept whole. That's another, weird thing that doesn't comport with one person, one vote that we have to deal with. But again, courts have mostly resolved these issues for now. There is a legal sort of workaround that they've decided, and we will get into a little more detail about that in the next unit. All right, what didn't we learn from the state constitution? So how does the legislature draw the maps? Like, how do they actually draw the maps? What process are they using when they're drawing the maps? What standards are they using? Besides districts have to be contiguous and have equal population, we don't know. Who's actually drawing the maps? So like the legislature is responsible, but who's literally sitting down and drawing all those lines? The state constitution doesn't tell us that. When does redistricting happen? So we know it has to happen in the first session after the census is returned. We don't know anything else about the timeline. We don't have a specific timeline in our constitution. What data will the legislature use? So we do feel like it's implied that we use census data, but we also don't know what other kinds of data might be used, and census data is not legally mandated. So will there be public input? Public input is not referred to in our state constitution. There's no state constitutional requirement for the redistricting process to include public input. How would public input be taken? How would it be used? None of that's in our state constitution. How open and transparent will the process be to the public? Also not in our state constitution. Our state constitution gives the responsibility to draw the maps to the legislature and really says very little else about anyone else's involvement, including the public. All right. So let's talk about the actual process. So redistricting is not, in North Carolina, super special. I'll explain what I mean by that. You have this little picture here from Schoolhouse Rock of the bill. I don't know if you've seen that. Probably have to be at least my age or older, but it was this cute cartoon that explained how a bill moves through the U.S. Congress. And the point of this is to say that in the past in North Carolina, redistricting has basically been procedurally treated the same way as any other bill that you would have go through the legislature, with a few differences. But for the most part, the basic process the bill undergoes is the same as the standard process for passing any other kind of bill in our General Assembly. And if you don't know much about how that process works, I have linked here, and I will put in our sources, a little flow chart that was put together by the legislature itself, called How an Idea Becomes a Law in North Carolina, and you can look through that. The basics are, the bill is proposed, it is referred to committee, it is voted on in committee, it is voted on the floor of whatever house it was introduced in, and then it moves to the other house and goes through the same procedure. That's the basics, but if you want to know more, please refer to that nice little flow chart that our legislature put together for us. Right. But redistricting is a little bit special. So there are some things about the redistricting process that are at least very uncommon to happen with other bills, and some aspects of them maybe never happen. So a couple of the main differences to think about are a lot of bills are filed with the legislative clerk first, and then they get assigned to a committee and discussed in that committee. So a lot of the time, legislators are just writing bills, filing them, and then they come up in committee for discussion. Redistricting bills typically arise out of committee discussions. So the redistricting committees in the House and Senate will typically have a number of meetings where they decide things like the criteria that they will use to draw districts, which is something we will again go into much more detail in later parts of this course. And they make other decisions about the process, and maybe they might decide when they're going to hold public hearings and stuff like that. So they'll do a lot of work in committee before any redistricting bills are actually written and filed. So that's one difference. Also, the legislature only rarely holds public hearings on other types of bills, and then typically only after the bill has been filed. And even if there are hearings in those other cases, they usually only take place in Raleigh. So during redistricting in North Carolina, multiple public hearings are typically held. Like I said before, they're not required by our Constitution, but typically we will see multiple public hearings held. Those hearings will be held across the state, and they will be held usually before and after the actual redistricting bills are filed. And online comments are usually also accepted at the same time. So those are two ways that the redistricting bill is different from a normal bill, perhaps. Okay. So here is a sample redistricting timeline for 2021. This is based on what we saw happen in 2011. So this rough timeline is kind of what it looked like in 2011. But remember, there's no specific timeline mandated by law, and public hearings are also not mandated. So what we would usually see is that in January and February of 2021, the committee chairs for the House and Senate redistricting committees would be appointed, and the members of those committees would also be appointed. Then in March, when the census data is returned to the states, we will probably start to see the first meetings of the redistricting committees where they would have those initial discussions about criteria and public hearings and all kinds of things. And then in April and May, we would probably see a first round of public hearings occurring across the state to take public input before the bills are filed. And then in June, we would probably see the actual redistricting bills that contain the maps being filed and introduced in committee. And then in July, there would probably be a second round of public hearings on the actually filed maps. And then usually the redistricting bills themselves after that second round of hearings would be passed very quickly through the legislature in the normal procedure. So this is a sample of what it could look like. Now, I want to note right now that this is also complicated by the fact that the census has now requested a delay. So because of coronavirus and people not leaving their homes, obviously it's a bit harder for the census to gather the data it needs to gather. And so parts of the census process have been pushed back, often by months, to allow them to properly gather that data. So a couple of parts of this that are really relevant for redistricting are apportionment. So apportionment meaning the process by which the government decides which states get how many representatives each state gets based on its population. Obviously that changes when they take the census and the population changes. So we would typically get information about which representative seats are moving around to different states between July and December of 2020 in a typical process. However, because of the delay, the census is now predicting that we will not get that information until between October of 2020 and April of 2021. So obviously that's a very big pushback. And then redistricting data itself, so like the actual population data that the legislature uses to draw the maps, we would typically get between January and March of 2021. And the census is now predicting that the data will be released between May and July 2021. So obviously that's a huge difference. It's a huge difference of months, right? And it's going to necessarily delay the redistricting process that happens in the states, the redistricting process that happens here in North Carolina. And I will guarantee you that some state legislators will try to use this delay as an excuse to cut down on public participation in the redistricting process and reduce or eliminate certain transparency measures. So they will say, we don't have time to hold public hearings across the state. We don't have time to upload the mapping files so that people can see them. We don't have time to give people notice about the votes on these redistricting bills. That will happen. If it doesn't happen, I don't know. I will buy you all like a root beer float or something, because I guarantee that that will happen next year. And we need to be prepared for it, and we cannot let them do that. You know, the excuse will be, we have candidate filing dates that we have to meet. The maps have to be ready by then. There are things they can do about that. So don't let them use this as an excuse to push you out of the process. Right. Just my very intense PSA for this lesson. All right, key takeaways. So from that earlier list of things that we didn't learn from the state constitution about redistricting, what of those have we answered when we talked about the process? And so here you can see there are check marks where we know things for certain. There are X's where we don't know things. And then I've put the little emoji thinky face for places where we know a little bit, but we definitely don't know everything. So how does the legislature draw the maps? I mean, obvious thinky face there. We don't know every detail. What process do we use? That's one thing that we do know. We know that they use pretty much the standard legislative process for redistricting. What standards do we know when they draw them? What standards do we know that they use when they draw the maps? Again, thinky face, we know that the districts have to be contiguous. We know that they have to have the same amount of population by inhabitants. We really don't know any of the other standards they use. They could use all kinds of standards. In the past, they've used election data to make sure that districts have a certain political composition. They've used racial data to make sure districts have a certain racial composition. We just don't know, because those things, none of those things are mandated by the Constitution or the process itself. Who's actually drawing the maps? So like I asked before, yeah, the state legislature has the legal responsibility to draw the maps, but who's actually sitting down and physically drawing the maps? Is it legislators sitting in the legislature drawing those maps in public on computers? Is it some kind of consultant they've hired drawing it in a dark room in his house by himself? Is it legislators sitting in their offices behind closed doors making deals and drawing the districts that way? We just don't know. All of those things have happened in the past. We don't know which one of those things is going to happen in 2021. So when does redistricting happen? So like I said, we have this vague timeline of things, of how things have happened before, and we think it's likely that they'll follow that same pattern, but we don't know the exact timeline. And especially now with the issues with the census, we really don't know the exact timeline. So yeah, that also, something that we don't know. What data will the legislature use? So, like I said, traditionally, the legislature uses data that they get from the census. But in the past, they've also used political data, like the results of elections. And like I said, they've used racial demographic data also. We just don't know the extent of the data that they will actually use. They will likely use census data. They could use something else, and they could use things in addition to census data, right? So will there be public input? Again, probably, most likely, there will be some form of public input. We don't know exactly what it'll look like. We assume there will be hearings of some kind held across the state, but I couldn't give you the exact number of hearings or exactly where they'll be or anything like that. And how will that public input be used? Again, there's nothing in the state constitution that mandates that they have to listen to the public input when they're drawing the maps. there's nothing in the process that says that they have to listen to public input when they're drawing the maps. They just routinely do have public hearings and take public input. But again, we don't know anything about exactly how that will happen or how that information is used. Last question, how open and transparent will the process be? Again, we don't know. I suppose you could say there's a lower bar here in that redistricting committee meetings and public hearings will have to be open to the public just by North Carolina's open meetings laws. But in terms of people's access to the mapping files, people being able to watch the maps being drawn, people having access to, if they hire a consultant, to that person's algorithms or process, that's all stuff that is up in the air. It's not mandatory. So we don't know how transparent the process will be beyond the base minimums guaranteed by our open meetings laws. All right, so in summary, the legislature has complete control over the redistricting process. No other government official has any real power, neither do ordinary citizens. The state constitution has minimal explicit criteria for the districts, so the districts have to be contiguous. They have to have the same population. Otherwise, legislators can draw the districts however they want. I mean, according to just the bare minimum of what you see in the Constitution. Public input in the process is not mandated by the Constitution. So while we know that traditionally public input is taken, it's very easy for the legislature to manipulate the form in which that happens. In past court-ordered redraws, we've seen them refuse to hold hearings anywhere outside of Raleigh, which obviously means that most of the people in the state have no access to those public hearings. We just don't know what kind of public input they will even allow. So we are going to have to fight for every ounce of input and transparency that we can get. Again, there's no set timeline for the process. We have some general ideas about how it could go, but with the census delay and also the fact that there's just no legally mandated timeline, we don't know. And so we have to be prepared to be flexible with that. So all this is kind of depressing. And I have put here this famous meme of Michael Jordan, a native North Carolinian, to show how I feel about this. The gerrymandered legislature has a lot of power over how maps are drawn, and the ordinary people of North Carolina have basically no official power. And that is pretty upsetting. No joke. But to inject a little bit of hope, I wanted to come back to this part of our state constitution that says all elections shall be free. And I hope this gives a little bit of hope, because I think for a long time, especially pre-civil rights era, this clause of our state constitution probably felt like it didn't mean anything. A lot of people were shut out of the process. A lot of people are still shut out of the process. But I also want to say that a lot of people in this state have fought really, really hard, especially over the past decade, to make this section mean something, and make this section mean something with regards to redistricting. And so we will spend time on that in the next unit of this course, where we will be talking a lot about North Carolina redistricting history and the various litigation about North Carolina redistricting. But I just want to say that this section is meaningful. It's not just a throwaway, and I want you all to remember that. And I want you to know that we can win fair maps for North Carolina. So just to say, tried to find another North Carolina related meme for this slide, but apparently when you search for a North Carolina meme, we really only make memes about how we empty all the bread aisles during hurricanes, how no one here can drive in the snow, and how the weather here is really crazy. Basically, we only make memes about the weather in North Carolina. So instead, here's Yoda. So we made this course because we believe that you can impact the process and help win fair maps for North Carolina in 2021. We know that in past processes, public engagement has won us more opportunities for public input, has won us more transparency, has gotten us better maps than we would have had otherwise. And that's in past processes when, for instance, during the quarter redraws that happened so quickly, we didn't have time to prepare the way that we're preparing in this leadership course. So the whole purpose of this course is to make sure to maximize how effective you can be in fighting for fair maps in 2021, to make sure that you are able to take advantage of every opportunity in the process to make sure that North Carolina gets fair maps next year. So that is what this course is about. I believe it can happen. I think everyone at All on the Line really and truly believes that we can do this. And also, honestly, it has worked in the past. We have gotten more public hearings because of objections raised by ordinary citizens. We have gotten more transparency because of objections raised by ordinary citizens. So it can be done. So, I think it's sort of a trope that if you want to feel empowered, you take action. So one thing that you can do today to maybe feel a little bit better about our process here is to take on this assignment that I've put together that's going to be on the course site. And the assignment is to start to develop a relationship with your state legislators. So one of the best things that you can do to prepare for next year is to start developing a relationship with your state legislators. If you start developing that relationship now, you make yourself known to them, you contact them regularly, you make sure that they understand what your policy priorities are. Once redistricting starts, they know you, they know you're super engaged, they know that you're going to stay on top of them and care about what they do and hold them accountable. And that is actually really, really powerful because frankly, a lot of our state legislators don't get tons of constituent feedback, and so the constituent feedback that they get really, really matters and really impacts them. So that is the assignment that I put together for you. It has some steps that show you how to find your legislators and a template letter that you can send to them over email. Also, we're getting close to the end of this first unit, and I am putting together a quiz for you all that will cover the material in the last lesson on what are redistricting and gerrymandering, and this lesson about the North Carolina redistricting process. So that quiz will also be in on the course page. It's not mandatory. I'm not going to grade you. It's just there if you want to make sure that you feel like you've absorbed everything from the lessons. See how good you are. All right, and next. So the next lesson is going to be what we are calling a deep dive lesson. So a lot of the lessons in this course, like this lesson and the previous one, are things that we feel like are basics, stuff that everyone should know about the redistricting process. We will also be doing these deep dive lessons where it's not necessarily essential to you participating in the most effective way in the process. However, if you want to know more, if you want to dive deeper, if you want to get more specific information, more detail, see a specific example of something that we've talked about in a previous lesson, that's what we will be doing in these deep dive lessons. So the next lesson will be a deep dive into the 2011 redistricting process. So we will be going in depth exactly what happened during that process, step by step, who were the players, what was the political context, the historical context of what was happening that year. Basically, we'll walk you through every possible detail of that particular process so that if you want to, you can see what some of the North Carolina process looked like in action 10 years ago. And frankly, also, a lot of the players who were involved in that process are still around, and so you will get some context about them. All right, thank you for bearing with me through this whole lesson. I am so glad to be here with you. I hope that you enjoyed it. Again, if you have any questions, please contact me over email. My email is in our syllabus. It is Shupek, SHUPECK, @redistrictingaction.org. And I hope to see you all again soon.